Hi, welcome to Melissa's Money Mindset. As many of you may know, when I'm not working on my e-commerce businesses or working on this YouTube channel, you can find me building and growing my real estate investment company. That means looking at lots of properties, running numbers, buying the ones that make sense, often renovating them, and then picking really high quality tenants to live there. But you might be wondering what factors I take into consideration when determining whether or not a tenant will be a good fit for me and my properties. Will they actually pay their rent on time? Will they actually take care of this property that I have now spent so much money purchasing and renovating? And what questions in particular should I be asking them during the tenant screening process? And a lot of time, the answers that you receive during this tenant screening due diligence process could be the difference between making a lot of money as a real estate investor and losing money. And honestly, the difference between a relatively passive form of income or hearing from your tenants every day, maybe having to potentially deal with an eviction down the road, or maybe even the tenant damaging your property. So today I've got 9 tenant screening tips for you. So whether you're a fellow real estate investor, a property manager, or a landlord, keep on watching. And before we get into the video, if you could please do me a huge favor and like this video, subscribe to my channel, and don't forget to hit that notification bell so that you never miss another money-making tip. Let's get right into it. Tip number 1, establish clear criteria. Now, it's really important that you do this before screening any tenants at all. So while you're in the process of listing your property on the market, I personally go through and I make a Google Doc of all of the specific criteria that I'm looking for in tenants. Now, keep in mind that all of these must be non-discriminatory criteria, but for example, they could include things like minimum credit scores, income thresholds, if that is allowed in your jurisdiction, or rental history requirements. And by having all of these criteria in place, you're essentially ensuring fairness and consistency across the rental application process. And also make sure that this document is dated. This is essentially a CYA, a cover your butt move. In case a tenant comes back and says that you potentially discriminated against them, it's nice to have all of this information dated and written down before you start screening any applicants for a potential property. And again, this essentially creates an audit trail in case any future disputes arise, and also shows your commitment to abiding by state and local regulations. Tip number 2 is find a good screening tool. I like the Zillow Rental Manager option because you can view their application, their credit history, their employment history, and their background check all in the same spot so that you're not having to go to a bunch of different locations. It's all in one nice, easy, organized place for you. And again, going back to that non-discriminatory criteria, it's really important, and Zillow ensures that each tenant fills out the exact same application, and we're collecting the exact same data from each person that applies. Now, I'll pop up some video right here of what your potential tenants will see when they're filling out this Zillow Rental Manager application to live in your property. So the first section here is about personal information, so they can input their legal name, their contact info, and of course, an About Me section. The next section is about housing information. So this will ask them about any co-residents that may be living in the property with them. So anybody over the age of 18 will have to fill out their own application. It will also ask them about a potential move-in date and any pets that they may want to have living with them. The next section is about residence history. So it asks them where they currently live and any past homes. And in this section, you can find contact information for their previous landlords. The next section is identity verification. So their social security number, their date of birth, and some other security questions. The second to last section is income history. So what their current income is, their employment history. And there's also a section here for people to upload past tax returns or even current W-2s. And the final section are screening reports. Now, I do believe there is a $35 one-time non-refundable fee if they're going to fill out this Zillow Rental Manager application. But the nice part about this is that they can use this application for the next 30 days, and they can apply to as many properties as they want to within that 30-day period. Tip number 3, background checks and tenant screening reports. Now, it's nice that Zillow Rental Manager includes all of this information for us, and I'll talk a little bit more about how you can use this information later. But make sure that you're up to date on your state and local regulations so that you know exactly how you can and cannot use the information that you may find out during this disclosure process. The first screening report that you can see is a criminal history report. So this will tell you a history of any felonies or misdemeanors or whether they have an arrest record at all. The next is employment history. So you'll be able to verify their current employment and make sure that they can actually pay the rent that you're charging. And the final tenant screening is credit history. So under this section, you'll be able to see payment history, any past bankruptcies, credit inquiries, outstanding debts, and of course, past evictions. Now, a word to the wise here, when you're looking at their employment verification information, I personally would make sure to call their place of employment because a lot of times people can figure out how to doctor their W-2s. And so maybe they got fired from their job yesterday, or maybe they haven't worked for that company in years, or maybe they never actually have. So always call their current place of employment and make sure that they are currently employed. Now, if they're self-employed, I think it's quite reasonable to ask for 1 to 2 years of tax returns. Again, to verify that they do have income and they are able to pay the rent that you're asking. And once you can see all of their credit history and their income verification information, you can easily calculate their debt to income ratio, which is really helpful in determining if essentially that particular tenant can afford to rent your property in the first place. A good rule of thumb is that you want rent plus utilities and all other debts to be less than 40% of their monthly income. In addition to all of that information, you'll also be able to see any civil court records, and that includes any pending lawsuits, any liens, and any judgments. The fourth tip is to have a minimum credit score requirement. Now, as you all know, credit score is generally a great indicator of someone's overall financial health. And a credit score is a great baseline because it's essentially a snapshot into someone's financial history. It tells you how they managed their money in the past and likely how they'll continue to manage their money moving forward. Now, there is one update coming in 2025, and I believe that all medical debt will now not be shown on someone's credit history report. And that could make it challenging to determine, again, whether or not someone can actually afford to live in your property. So that's just something to be mindful of moving forward. And again, I'll pop up some video here on the screen so that you can see exactly what I see on the back end of Zillow, but I'm able to see the tenant's current credit score, what percentage of their payments have been on time, their estimated monthly payment, their credit used, and of course their total debt. And if you scroll down a little bit farther, you can see all of their open accounts, any late payments that they may or may not have, and whether or not they've ever been sent to collections. Now, at least in the state of Colorado, we have what's called the Fair Credit Reporting Act, the FRCA, and it essentially says that if an applicant is denied based on credit information received, let's say their credit score was 400, Colorado landlords must provide what's known as an adverse action notice that basically informs the tenant of why they were rejected to live in that particular property. And again, this isn't just a courtesy. This is now law in the state of Colorado. So again, just another reason to be up to date on whatever state law and regulations you have to abide by. Tip number 5, setting income requirements. Now again, depending on where you live, this may or may not be allowed. It could potentially be seen as a form of discrimination. So again, look into your state and local laws to make sure that this is actually allowed in your area. Now again, Zillow does collect this information for you, and I do see tons of properties listed that essentially say that a tenant's income must be 3 times what the monthly rent is in order to be qualified for a particular property. So again, make sure that you're checking either local legislature or checking with an attorney to make sure that you can actually say that in your listing before you publish your listing live. Now, in addition to not being able to discriminate against someone based on their potential income, a few other categories that you have to be really mindful of not discriminating against include renting to someone based on their race, ethnicity, religion, age, family status, disability, citizenship status, or income source. And again, I'm just going to provide a local example for me since I live in the state of Colorado. Now, in the state of Colorado, we're having to now abide by the Fair Housing Act, which essentially says that you cannot discriminate against people based on where their income comes from. So for example, a lot of people receive government rental assistance. So for example, money towards Section 8 housing. So any money that somebody may receive that counts towards Section 8 housing payments has to be counted as a source of income and cannot be discriminated against. This is also true if maybe somebody has a questionable job. I'll leave that all up to your imaginations. You cannot discriminate against somebody based on any source of income. As long as they have income and they meet your income requirement, and that is allowed in your state, then they are considered an eligible tenant. Tip number 6, calling and contacting previous landlords to see how they were as a tenant. Now, I do this for every single tenant that I screen because, again, I want to make sure that the people that are moving into my property are going to respect it. They're not going to be a pain in my butt, and they're going to pay their rent on time. Now, a few years ago, I was really glad that I called somebody's previous landlord because come to find out, they were actually being kicked out of their current apartment because they were harboring a felon. And that particular apartment building did not allow felons to live on the property. And the property manager that I spoke to informed me that she had told the tenant multiple times and given her multiple written warnings to not allow this particular person, this convicted felon, back onto the property because they had committed a violent crime. And the tenant continued to not follow direction. And so they were now being evicted from that property and they needed somewhere to live quickly. And they chose to apply to my property because my property backed up to their old apartment building. So again, I was so glad that I called their current property manager to figure out what was going on. And that is a perfect example of how one property manager or property owner can help another one out. Now, you also might want to ask them, were they easy to deal with? Did they pay their rent on time? How much of their security deposit did they get back? Because that can give you a good idea of how well they took care of the property, and just try to get a good feel for them as a tenant in general and how they were to deal with so that you're not inheriting someone else's headache. Tip number 7, meet the tenant. I personally prefer to meet every single one of our potential tenants in person before we sign a lease with them. And that's for a few reasons. One, to just see how they are to deal with as a person. Can I take dealing with this person? Do I think they're going to be a pain in my butt? How do I think the next year with them is going to go? And also to do a little bit of a sniff test. So all of our properties are obviously private properties, and we have the right to say whether or not smoking will be allowed in the unit. So every single one of our units is a non-smoking unit. Tenants are not even allowed to smoke outside of the unit and come back inside because that smell just lingers wherever it goes. So I don't really care what you do with your personal time, but I don't want your habit of smoking to negatively affect my property that I've spent so much time and money on. Now, you can very easily smell either cigarette smoke or marijuana smoke on a potential tenant by meeting them in person. And we are really sticklers about this because we have purchased units in the past where the previous owners have allowed tenants to smoke like chimneys in the units, and it completely destroyed the unit. And we had to pay tens of thousands of dollars to correct that. Luckily, we got a good deal on the property, but we ended up having to take the entire property, both sides of this duplex, down to the studs. We had to suck all of the insulation out of the attic because it was all stained with nicotine and smoke smell, and pay to have new insulation blown up into the attic throughout the entire building. We also had to buy new furnaces and new air conditioners for both sides of the units. And we had to run all new HVAC ducting throughout the entire building. So after that entire ordeal, absolutely no smoking of any kind is tolerated on any of our properties or premises. Now, a lot of times tenants are moving from out of state. They might have an agent looking at the property for them. And if that's the case, that's totally fine. I still like to schedule a phone call or a video call just to, again, get a little bit better feel for who might potentially be renting my unit, how they might be to deal with, whether or not I think that they will pay their rent on time each and every month, and just to make sure that I establish that open line of communication with them. But again, during this conversation, I'm always very mindful of not asking any potentially discriminatory questions. Even things that you might perceive as just general conversation could potentially be perceived as discriminatory, so just be careful what you say. Tip number 8 is to have a pet policy. Again, this is completely up to any property owner to determine if they actually want to allow pets on their property. Now, this isn't a legal requirement unless it's a service animal. Those you do have to allow. And obviously, pets, as much as we love them, do cause more wear and tear on a property. So our policy for all of our properties is no more than 2 dogs specifically. We don't allow cats at the properties just because cat urine, the smell of cat urine is really, really hard to get out of carpets. If they pee on like LVP or hardwood flooring and it gets underneath the flooring, it's really hard to get that smell out. Now, again, make sure that you're up to date with any state and local regulations and rules about just how much you can potentially charge for a pet. So in Colorado, this was recently updated. You can charge $35 or up to 1.5% of the monthly rental amount per pet. And you can also charge a pet security deposit, and there's usually a cap on the security deposit that's allowed, and that is often refundable. Now, in our lease in particular, and I can include a screenshot here, we ask specifically for the breed of the dog, the size, their approximate weight, the color, so that if I'm over at the property and I see a dog that's not listed on the lease, I can ask the tenant about it and see what's happening. And I've actually had one of our tenants try to pull a fast one on me. So they were new tenants. They had just moved in. They told me that they had a medium-sized dog. I went over to the property because they were experiencing a plumbing problem. So I went over with the plumber, obviously giving them 24 hours notice and notifying the tenant that I was going to be over there. They were totally fine with it. I walk in, there's their medium-sized dog, and there's a cute little kitten in their master bedroom. So I again had to ask them, whose cat is this? Where did this cat come from? And this is not in the lease. And actually our property does not allow cats. So again, just another reason to be maybe doing a 6-month or 1-year check-in if your tenants are long-term tenants, because sometimes tenants don't disclose that information to you. They either don't think it's important, they don't want to pay a pet fee, a pet security deposit, or they're just trying to be a little bit sneaky. So again, that's just all part of being a landlord, property manager, or property owner, is staying on top of things like that. Tip number 9 is to look at their car. Now, this is a pretty subjective screening, but I would say that this gives you a pretty good idea of how they're going to treat your property. If you look at their car and their windshield is completely smashed to pieces, maybe a wheel is hanging on, or maybe they even have trash piled all the way up to the ceiling, that's probably exactly how they're going to treat your property. And they own their car and they're treating it that way. So if they don't own the property that they're renting from you, why would they treat it any better? Now, I'm not saying that this should be the only deciding factor. I'm just saying this is another thing to potentially consider during the due diligence process. So those were all of my 9 tips for screening a tenant. Now I do have a few red flags that I also wanted to mention. So the first red flag is wanting to move in the same day. Now this is really odd. This doesn't happen very often, but sometimes you go to tour a tenant around a property and they say, oh great, I'll fill out the application and can I move in today? And this is a huge red flag for me. Why are they needing to move somewhere so quickly? Usually moving is something that you arrange a month or more in advance. You have movers, you have friends helping you, you move slowly over time. It's usually not something where you pack up your old place in one day and you move into your new place really quickly. So maybe they're running from their current situation, a current partner. Maybe they're currently being evicted and they're hiding something from you. So make sure to ask some additional questions. And this is also a red flag because we usually require first and last month's rent and a security deposit that's equal to 1 month of rent. Now, all of our units are really nice and they rent for anywhere between $2,800 and $4,000 per month. So that's potentially tens of thousands of dollars that someone would have to fork over in one day. And again, if someone is willingly doing that, there's usually maybe a bad reason behind it. So I'm not saying that that's a complete deal breaker, but it should raise a red flag in your mind and make you ask a few additional questions. Red flag number 2 is not being able to pay the security deposit. Now, like I previously mentioned, we do require first and last month's rent plus a security deposit and a refundable pet deposit if they're moving in with a pet. Now, I've never personally had someone ask to do this, but I have heard from other property managers that people may ask to break up the security deposit payment over maybe the 12 months of the lease so that they're paying just a portion of the security deposit each and every month. Absolutely not. That is not allowed in my book. That would exclude someone from being a potential tenant. If they can't afford the security deposit, they might not be able to afford rent each and every month or even utilities. Most of our tenants pay all of their own utilities for their properties. And I don't want to be chasing someone around each and every month for payment. And again, a security deposit is just that. It's basically confirmation and it protects you in case the tenant doesn't take care of your property. So receiving just a portion of it each month is not going to be the safeguard that you need to have in place in case that tenant trashes your property. So again, that is a protection for me and for my property and something that I'm just not willing to sacrifice. The final red flag is not wanting to fill out the application. Now, again, this is an absolute non-negotiable for me. Again, as I said at the very beginning of this video, every single tenant that we sign, every single tenant and potential tenant fills out the exact same application. If they can't figure out how to fill out the application or they simply don't want to fill out the application, then they will not be considered to live in any of our properties. Now, I have had a few instances where maybe the potential tenant doesn't speak English as their primary language, so I often have to translate the application for them or translate the lease for them before they sign it. And sometimes I even have to go and meet with them in person, and that's totally fine. I don't have any problem doing that. I want them to be able to feel empowered to fill out the application, to know what they're signing if we choose to go with them as a tenant. And I want them to know what they're signing in the lease. I'm more saying this for if somebody is really combative about, oh, I don't want to fill out the application, that's a waste of time, or I'll just pay you in cash. No. And a lot of times people will rent to their own family and friends. And I don't care if you're my mom, I don't care if you're my sister, my brother, my best friend, you're still filling out the application because at the end of the day, this is a business. This is how I make money. This is how I make a living. This is not a charity. And to be frank with you, if your friends and family don't understand that, if they give you a hard time, then they probably don't really respect you in the first place. So don't let anybody give you a hard time about filling out the rental application. All of that to say, there are plenty of great tenants out there, so don't feel obligated to choose someone who might not be qualified, who isn't a good candidate to live in your property. Now, I'm very, very grateful that we have absolutely wonderful tenants. They all pay their rent on time. They've been re-signing their leases with us for years. They're very communicative if there's anything wrong, and they make sure that the properties are upkept. And while, yes, it is a property manager's goal to try and get tenants in the units as quickly as possible, I put a much higher priority on finding, again, good tenants who are going to pay their rent, be respectful and take care of their property, and who are easy to communicate with. And sometimes that does take me a month or 2 months of the property just sitting empty. But I will say that it's been well worth it for us in the long run. And the tenants that we do have only really bring things up when they need to be addressed. So be patient, be very thorough in your due diligence process, and you'll be well on your way to finding the right tenant for you and your property. So I hope that this video has been helpful to all fellow real estate investors, property managers, and landlords. Let me know if you have any questions. As always, feel free to follow me on my social channels right here, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.